Hey there folks, Andrew Swan here, and today I'm going to show you how to convert DVD video files into ProRes files using some free and open source video tools on Windows. Standard disclaimers apply. This is a Windows only tutorial. macOS and Linux users will need to look elsewhere. Also, please virus scan all files I tell you to download before installing them onto your system, just in case. And a special little warning for this tutorial. It is possible to violate copyright laws if you are not careful. More specifically, in the United States, we have something called the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which makes it a crime to circumvent copy protection measures on digital media. Because this tutorial will involve ripping DVDs, it is certainly possible to do that. If you get caught doing this to material that you do not have permission to use, you could get some serious fines and/or jail time, so don't do it. Also, I am not a lawyer, so do not consider anything that I'm going to tell you definitive legal advice. If you have any doubts whatsoever, consult a lawyer who is experienced in this area of the law. Generally, what I do is I make sure I have the explicit written permission of the copyright owner of the content before I decrypt the DVD. Usually it's because they've sent the DVD to me, but if you're not dealing with somebody who is both the, say, main producer and the copyright holder, you may want to clear that up first. Just whatever you do, stay on the right side of the law with this, or there can be nasty consequences. Okay? You have been warned. All right, so I have a blog. I've mentioned it before in my previous tutorials, but here it is. It's maceletthefront.blogspot.com. There'll be a link to it in the video description below, as well as the first pinned comment. All of the tutorials that I put up on YouTube will also have a corresponding blog post up there, and it will go into more detail about the setup process for the various programs that I'm going to tell you to install, as well as a link back to the corresponding video. If I need to make any minor changes to the process, it will show up on the blog. I will probably not make an additional video, so just be aware of that. So just in general, the blog's a good place to go and can maybe clear up a lot of potential questions that you might have. I'm just going to rush through the process of installing the software for this tutorial because otherwise it would take like an hour. And I've already covered the process of setting up AVISynth, AvSPMod, and FFmpeg in a previous video tutorial, as well as sort of an addition onto that for QTGMC, which is the deinterlacing plugin for AVISynth that I use. So if you want to check those out first before coming here, I will put that up in the recommended videos right about now. All right, moving along. MakeMKV will be our disk ripping tool. Basically what it does that is different than other disk ripping tools in the past is it takes all the video and audio data and rewraps it into a single MKV file, or multiple MKV files if you're dealing with multiple titles, but I'll get into that in a bit. This preserves the video and audio quality as opposed to transcoding it into a different codec first, like Handbrake does, and so is better for professional usage like what we're going to be doing today. MakeMKV is currently in beta, and that means that during that period it is free. However, it does have this 30-day trial thing on it still built in, which means that after 30 days of using it, it will revert to a free version that will only work with unencrypted DVDs. However, because it is in beta, generally there will be a new release every month or so that will reset that timer. if for whatever reason there isn't a new version out, go to the forum, go to news and announcements, and go to the post that says MakeMKV is free while in beta. The current beta key will be shown there, as well as its expiration date. So installing MakeMKV is very simple. It's just it's an installer file that just lets you go next, 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 finish. AVISynth will be our next program of choice, and as I said, I'm only going to briefly go over the process of installing this because it is considerably more complicated, but basically you're going to grab the official single-threaded build, install that, which is a fairly standard installer. Then you're going to grab the unofficial multi-threaded build, which is literally just a DLL file that I can just even show you. It's from some dude's Dropbox account. Just virus scan it before you load it onto your system. Yeah, it's an avisynth.dll file that you drop into your system32 directory, and it'll overwrite the single-threaded AVISynth's DLL file, and boom, you can do multi-threading. I am not yet ready to start using AVISynth Plus as the base for these tutorials. If QTGMC gets ported to 64-bit, however, that will probably be my next video. All right, so aside from those, the other thing you'll need off of the AVISynth wiki is under the external filters link, source filters, and FFmpegSource. This is the plugin that you will use to import your MKV files. And you just want to grab the standard FFMS2 file. Don't worry about the 10-bit hack version. AVISynth creates a plugins folder that you can access from your start menu. Let's see if I can actually just show it to you. Right, plugin directory. You'll just want to extract the contents of FFmpegSource's zip file into this directory, and that should do it. All right, to edit the AVISynth scripts, I highly, 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 highly recommend AvSPMod because it does syntax highlighting and command auto-completion, but also it has a built-in video preview window so that when you make changes to the script, you can almost instantly see those changes applied. Anyway, just grab it. It's worth it. And then finally, you're going to be grabbing the command line build of FFmpeg for Windows, which is on FFmpeg.zerono.com. Go ahead and grab the nightly Windows 32-bit static linking version. And we're sticking with 32-bit because the version of AVISynth I'm working with here is 32-bit as well. If you try and use the 64-bit version of FFmpeg with this process, it just will fail, basically. So, all right, so after downloading all of those and virus scanning them, you can actually set up FFmpeg to run from any directory on your computer. Just very briefly, what you do to do that is go to the run command, type in control space system period cpl 3, hit OK, click on environment variables, go to the path system variable, click edit, and what you'll do is you click on new, and you'll paste in the directory where you've installed FFmpeg. In this case, I have it set up under C program files x86, FFmpeg, and then you'll need the bin subfolder. But as you can see, I've already got that set up. Once that's done, just hit OK, 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 and you are done. If you don't want to deal with all of that, you can alternatively just extract out the FFmpeg.exe binary and drop it into whatever folder you're going to be extracting the video files out to. All right, let's fire up MakeMKV. And let's take out our DVD. And pop it in the drive. All right. So for most DVDs, you'll be able to just click on this giant drive icon and it'll load just fine. For some rare DVDs, especially if they've been mastered in some weird way, and I'm not talking about copy protection here, but rather like I had a DVD that came from a client that I think it was somehow mastered through Amazon CreateSpace or something like that, and it ended up being really funky. Like it would only load the first 2 chapters out of a like 7 or 8 chapter DVD. Each of the chapters was in its own title. It was really strange. Basically, if you run into one of those, you just check this Open DVD Manually checkbox, and then when you open up the disk, if you give it a sec, it'll give you kind of this raw information, and you can see all of the titles that are available on the disk, sort of regardless of how long they are. By default, MakeMKV will not load titles that are less than, I think it's like a minute in length. So if you have something funky where like somebody's added on a title that's like 30 seconds long or something like that as part of your program, then you would need to select that manually here. And you may also need to set the preferences in MakeMKV so that it will load titles that are less than a minute. Anyway, but to finish working with this in manual mode, the way that you do this is just load up each of the titles by their number, separated by a space. And it'll load up each of the titles separately, put it up in a list, depending on your DVD, that might be all part of one program that you're trying to export, in which case you'll get like a bunch of different titles that'll be exported out, and you'll just have to combine them later in an editing program. All right. But I'm going to cancel that because I know for sure that this DVD will actually work just fine with the regular process. So MakeMKV is now going to go through and enumerate all the titles on the disk, and I will come back once it is finished. Okay, now that the disk has loaded, you'll see a list of titles. So if you weren't clear by now, titles are individual programs on a DVD. So like the movie, or an episode of a TV show, or sometimes on DVDs they'll put like all of the episodes of a TV show as one title and just put a bunch of chapters to note where each of the different episodes start. But in this case, it's a documentary and a bunch of special materials, and I think this is a menu animation here. So just make sure that you uncheck all of the titles that you do not want to export. And for ones that you do want to export, make sure to go in, twirl down their menu, and see what audio tracks are available, and check only the one audio track you want to export. You can technically export out more than one audio track and then select it at the next step in the process, but I generally don't recommend doing that just because it's like an additional hassle. Like, why would you want to go through that? The only reason to do that is if you had to make multiple versions of a particular video using different language tracks or something like that, in which case you could note which tracks that you select and realize that in the next step they'll be counted as like audio track 1, 2, 3, 4, counting down from the top of the tracks that are selected, not their presence on the DVD itself. So anyway, make sure that you have everything checked you want, and then go over to this properties panel here under name. And, if you don't care about this, you can just extract the DVD and it'll put everything out by like title01.mkv, title02, title03, etc. But in this case, I want to call it tutorial. So I'll type that in, hit enter, and now all of the files will be labeled tutorial _ T01 or T02, etc. It'll always append on that _ T01, 02, etc. to whatever files you output. So just keep that in mind. Make sure also that you're going to the right output folder. I'm going to go ahead and set the output folder, in this case, to my tutorial folder. And when everything's set, just hit MakeMKV. And once again, based on the length of the titles, the condition of the disk, and the amount of copy protection present on the disk, this may be a relatively short process for extracting, or it may take a while. I once again will leave this to run and come back when it's finished. Okay, so once that's extracted, we can close MakeMKV. Open up the folder where the video has been extracted to, and we've got an MKV file. It probably would be a good idea to play it back at this point to make sure that everything came through okay. Which I will just go
or something
ahead
like
and
that.
do.
Sorted them out
Smoothly.
level, which is what
The state's population is growing.
All right, and that seems to work. If you can't get this to play back, you may need to install VLC, otherwise known as Video LAN Client, which you can find with just a quick Google search. So, next step. We're going to create a new text file. And I'm going to call this tutorial. And change the 3-letter extension to .avs. Boom. Now, if you don't get this icon here, that's probably because that you haven't set up AvSPMod to open AVISynth scripts by default. All you got to do for that is right-click, open with, choose another app, more apps, look for another app on this PC, and let's see. Go to where AvSPMod is installed, select it, hit OK, and you're good to go. Do make sure, however, though, that you have always use this app to open AVS files checked. Okay? All right. Once that is set up, go ahead and open up AvSPMod. Go ahead and open up your AVISynth script. And let's start the following commands. Now, if you are going to be using deinterlacing using QTGMC, you will need to start this with a set MT mode command. I generally will use 5,10 for my system. The 5 will be the same regardless of what system you're using. The 10 is based on the number of logical processors on your system. If you want to know how many of those are, just go to Task Manager, Performance, look under the CPU entry, and look where it says logical processors. It's basically the same as the number of cores unless you have hyperthreading enabled, in which case it's double the amount of cores. So you start with that number, and if you run into stability problems with this process, then you can move that number down. I've found that going 2 less than my number of total logical processors works fine, but you know, your mileage may vary. All right, next up, we're going to load FFmpegSource 2, which has a ridiculous number of options available for it. But we only need the following. In quotes, you will put the name of the file. Which you can get by right-click, Properties, and paste that in. Then do a comma, then a track equals 1. And you remember when I said that you could select additional audio tracks? Well, this is where you would do it. Once again, going from sort of the top to the bottom in MakeMKV, when you were selecting the audio tracks, you'd start with a track equals 1, a track equals 2, a track equals 3, etc. And that's the loading command. So let's check and make sure everything works here by just taking the playback head and moving it somewhere else. And after anywhere between a couple of seconds to like 30 seconds, it should pop up. The first time that you do this with a video file using FFmpegSource, it will create this FFindex file. And the reason behind that is because DVD video files are not all keyframes. Like, they have some periodic keyframes, and then they interpolate between those keyframes to store the video data. So it needs to generate this FFindex file in order to move frame by frame, basically. It's similar to what Premiere Pro does with various formats as well. So you can kind of scrub through, see how everything's working. You might notice that the image will either look a little bit squashed vertically or horizontally. If it's squashed vertically, then it's a 4:3 aspect ratio image, in which case you will want to do a resize like the following. Bilinear resize, and I generally like to do 720 by 540 for NTSC video. I don't know what the equivalent is for PAL, but you can kind of go and look that up. Basically, it's just converting between different pixel aspect ratios. Old style CRT televisions and video display monitors use vertical rectangular pixels, versus pretty much every other type of monitor that uses square pixels. So this just basically resizes the image to correct for that difference. However, if it's squashed horizontally like this, that probably means that it's a 16:9 anamorphic DVD, which means that it's taken a 16:9 aspect ratio image and squashed it to fit within a 4:3 frame. In that case, you can either do a number that kind of approximates the 16:9 aspect ratio, or you can go straight to like 720 by 1280, which is done 1280, 720 in the resize command. I generally just do that because it's cleaner, and if you're using something like QTGMC, that will result in you getting a basically 60 frames progressive output, 720p supports that frame rate natively. So there we go. Working just fine. Now, you might notice that the image looks a little soft. This is because you're upscaling from a relatively low resolution to a higher resolution. You can address that in two ways. One is by changing the resize method to something like Lanczos or Spline64. I prefer Spline64. It might be hard to see through YouTube, but that does introduce a noticeable amount of sharpening. You don't want to go too crazy with sharpening, however, because DVDs are heavily compressed and show visible compression artifacts, which you will see around the edges of high contrast areas of the image. Let me see if I can find a clearer example here. There's a nice hard line. Now, you can kind of see some compression artifacts in here. Anyway, the more that you sharpen, the more that you accentuate the compression artifacts. So just bear that in mind. If a simple resize with some additional sharpening isn't enough, you can download a AVISynth plugin called Limited Sharpen, which will let you do Limited Sharpen faster. A pretty cool little sharpening filter. It's got a bunch of settings, but the default generally works pretty well. However, if you look up close, and let me see if I can find a representative image. All right. It'll look great on images with lots of low motion and not a lot of random noise, but in images that do have a lot of noise, it will you will start to see those compression artifacts really pop out, and you'll notice it a lot more when the video's in motion too. So let's see if I can show you here. Yeah, I don't know how much of this will translate through to YouTube, but it's pretty obvious. So I generally just do a Spline64 resize and leave it at that. And if you are happy with your results, regardless, go ahead and save your file, close it. And now we're going to create a batch file to run FFmpeg, which involves creating another text document, naming it whatever you want. I'm going to call it tutorial in this case, and rename the .txt extension to .bat. There you go. Now this is a somewhat longer command, so I'm actually going to paste in the command and kind of tailor it to our specific needs here. The first thing I'm going to do is get the name of the AVISynth script and copy it, and then paste that in. And let's remove that. All right, so here's a nice simple command line for doing this process. You'll start by calling FFmpeg, then a space, then -i, a space, and the name of your AVISynth script, then another space. Then we'll call the video codec via -c:\v, a space, and then ProRes. Now there are two major implementations of ProRes in FFmpeg. The one that's just called ProRes and one that's called ProRes Custoya, otherwise known as ProRes_KS. I've used Custoya in the past because it has more fine-grained control over quality, but for most use cases, especially for cases like this where you don't necessarily want to just throw a ton of bit rate at the image, the standard ProRes is way faster and does not result in a significant difference in image quality. So, especially if you set the subcodec of ProRes using -profile:\v to 3, which is ProRes 422HQ. It's okay to go down to 2, which is standard ProRes 422. I wouldn't go any lower than that, just because the lower codecs are designed primarily for proxy usage and not really suitable for professional work as a intermediate codec. All right. After that, we're going to set the color space so that it is compatible with ProRes by doing -pix_FMT YUV 422P10LE. That's planar 10-bit 422 YUV color space. Yeah, it's a mouthful, but trust me, without this, you'll just get an error when you run the script. Okay, then we're going to set the audio codec using -C:(A) space, then PCM_S16LE. If you are using DTS audio in your MKV file, then you will want to change this from 16 to 24 because DTS is 20-bit audio, and if you export it out in 16-bit uncompressed form, it will clip the dynamic range of the audio. So don't do that. But for most Dolby Digital stuff, it's perfectly fine. All right. Finally, you will put in quotes the name of your output video as well as any path address that you want to put in. So in this case, I've got it on the E drive with E:/tutorial, which is the folder I'm putting it into, /outputvideo.mov. Make sure that the .mov is on there rather than any other extension, because ProRes is only supported within a QuickTime MOV container. Anything else, it just won't work. When you're happy with that command line, then just save your file, close it, and if everything is set up properly, you should just be able to double-click the batch file and it should run. And in fact, you will notice that this is kind of kicking butt. It's using pretty much the entire CPU. If you use the additional filter that I showed you for sharpening, that will decrease the speed by a fair amount. If you use QTGMC, that will really decrease the speed. Just be aware, also your time encoding this will depend a lot on the processor you have in your system. Mine is an i7 Sandy Bridge E chip, so it's relatively beefy for its time, but I bought this computer in 2012, so there are certainly much faster systems available today. I will leave this to render and come back when it is finished. This is running right now at about 4 and some change real-time speed, so it'll probably take me about 20 minutes or so. So see you guys after that's done. Okay. Now let's take a look at our output video.
You know, you look out in a large field and you need an expended
from a front turn signal from
in the 1940s. We think if we had probably 4 people.
So it's looking all right. It's not going to be amazing. DVDs are, as I mentioned, relatively low resolution and pretty high compression with visible compression artifacts. So you shouldn't expect this to come out looking like real HD footage. But by going through this process, you should end up with a file that is way easier to work with in editing and would be higher quality than transcoding everything over to an H.264 highly compressed file like you would out of Handbrake. So anyway, that should pretty much do it. Obviously, if you had some interlacing artifacts that show up in this output, then you need to go back in and try the process again with deinterlacing. You can do some basic deinterlacing in FFmpeg. or you can go in and use Q2GMC and do some more fancy, complicated stuff. If you want to do the latter, then I have complete instructions on how to do that in the previous 2 tutorials that I've worked on. So go and check those out, or just check it out on the blog. But I think that should pretty much do it for this tutorial. Thank you all for watching, and if you have any questions or constructive criticism, put it down in the comments section below. If you have some non-constructive criticism, don't be surprised if I just ignore it. Anyway, for next time, I think I will be looking at using Shotcut as kind of a really simple video conversion tool, which is not really what it's designed for. It's meant to be kind of a simple video editing program, but I found that due to the way that it works, it actually is probably the quickest way to do a conversion of one video file to a different codec without using the command line version of FFmpeg. So anyway, aside from that, all I can say is happy editing, and hopefully I'll see you guys next time.